Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be looking at climate news today. Everything from policy shifts to new innovations.
Yeah, it seems like a very active landscape right now. A lot happening both domestically and internationally.
For sure. So let's just jump right in, starting with the Trump administration's decision to cancel $4 billion in funding to the UN's Green Climate Fund. Now, this fund was specifically designed to help developing countries transition to cleaner energy and adapt to the already existing impacts of climate change.
Right. And this is a really significant move that could have a ripple effect globally. It signals a pretty clear shift in U.S. priorities away from that international climate cooperation. And it also leaves a pretty sizable funding gap that other nations are going to have to figure out how to address.
This also comes at a time when nearly 200 nations are struggling to meet a deadline for submitting updated climate plans for 2035 under the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, and the Green Climate Fund was really seen as a key tool to help developing countries meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement. So without that funding, it's going to be really difficult for a lot of these nations to implement the plans that they've made, and that could really slow down the progress towards meeting those Paris Agreement goals.
Absolutely. And domestically, the Trump administration's actions are also raising some eyebrows. This focus on increasing oil and gas production whilst simultaneously freezing funds for clean energy initiatives. It seems a little bit counterintuitive, especially when you consider that Republican states have actually benefited significantly from the clean energy investments that were spurred by the Biden-era climate laws.
It's definitely a complex situation. On one hand, the administration is very clearly prioritizing domestic energy production and, those traditional industries. But on the other hand, this move could actually end up undermining the economic growth that we've been seeing in those renewable energy sectors. And that's particularly true in a lot of those Republican states that have really seen a surge in clean energy manufacturing.
Right. So while the political landscape is certainly presenting a lot of challenges, there's also a lot of innovation happening on the ground. And one area where this is really evident is wildfire management.
Yeah, California in particular is sort of at the forefront of that, and they're trying out a new concept called water trees. So basically, these are these huge balloon-like water tanks that are strategically placed in high-risk areas to provide that readily available water source for firefighting efforts.
That's interesting. So what would you say are the main advantages of using a system like that?
Well, they could be really beneficial in areas that have limited access to traditional water sources. Think about really remote regions or places where wildfires often spread much faster than fire trucks can get there carrying water. So it's really a localized and much more proactive approach to dealing with the threat of wildfires.
I see. But there was a recent report that suggested that just simply clearing brush around Los Angeles might not actually be as effective at reducing wildfire risk as we previously thought.
And, wildfires are incredibly complex and influenced by so many different factors. Obviously, weather patterns, but also vegetation types and even human activity plays a big role. So while clearing brush might seem like the most logical solution, it can actually backfire. Sometimes it ends up altering the ecosystem in ways that actually make the area more susceptible to those wildfires.
Yeah, it really highlights the need, I think, for a much deeper understanding of wildfire management and how to approach it effectively. And speaking of ecosystems, there's some very promising research coming out of Southeast Asia about the role that peatlands and mangroves can play.
Yeah, and conserving and restoring these natural habitats could be a real game changer when it comes to reducing carbon emissions. Peatlands and mangroves are just incredibly effective carbon sinks. They absorb and store huge amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So protecting and restoring those ecosystems is really a powerful nature-based solution to climate change.
So it's not just about reducing the emissions that we're creating through human activities, but also about using nature to help mitigate the climate change that's already happening.
Exactly.
And all of this brings us to the energy transition itself. Are we moving fast enough? And are we doing it the right way?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're seeing both encouraging trends and some developments that are a little bit concerning. Investment in renewable energy is growing, but some major players in the energy sector are making decisions that kind of raise questions about their commitment to a rapid transition.
Yeah, like the Norwegian energy giant Equinor. They recently announced plans to cut their renewable energy investments while actually increasing oil and gas production. They cited slow returns on renewables as the reason for this shift.
And this decision really reflects a tension that exists between short-term profits and long-term sustainability. Renewable energy technologies have come a long way, but they might not yet yield those same quick profits that traditional fossil fuel investments do. So it's a real challenge for these companies trying to balance their financial interests with this urgent need to decarbonize rapidly.
It also makes it clear that we need government policies and incentives that can accelerate the development and deployment of these renewable energy technologies to make them more commercially viable and attractive to those investors. But even as we push for a clean energy future, we have to be mindful of potential downsides and unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And I think the boom in nickel mining is a perfect example of that. Nickel is a key component in electric vehicle batteries, and the surge in demand has led to environmental damage and even a health crisis in Indonesia, which is one of the world's largest nickel producers.
And that situation really brings to light the importance of ethical and sustainable practices throughout that entire supply chain of clean energy technologies.
Yeah, the transition to clean energy has to be managed responsibly. We need to be thinking about the environmental and social impacts of everything from the resource extraction to the manufacturing process, and even how we dispose of these technologies at the end of their life. Otherwise, we're just shifting the problem from one place to another.
Right. So it's not just about switching to renewables. It's about doing it in a way that minimizes the harm and ensures that the future we're building is truly sustainable.
So let's shift our focus a little bit to the global stage where climate action is facing some pretty significant hurdles.
Yeah, I mean, the deadline for nations to submit their updated climate plans for 2035 has already passed.
Yeah.
And a lot of countries just didn't make it.
Yeah, it's pretty concerning. Out of almost 200 nations, only a handful actually met that requirement. It really raises questions about how committed countries actually are to those Paris Agreement goals. That agreement that aims to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels.
Right.
So the Paris Agreement requires countries to regularly update their plans for how they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change. And these delays in submitting those plans suggest that many nations are lagging behind in their efforts.
And all of this is happening at the same time that the Green Climate Fund, which was specifically designed to support developing nations in their climate efforts, is facing funding cuts from the U.S.
Exactly. And the head of the fund has actually been urging other developed nations to step up and increase their contributions to try and offset those cuts from the U.S. That fund plays such a critical role in helping vulnerable countries make that transition to cleaner energy sources and adapt to the impacts that they're already feeling from climate change.
Right.
So a shortage of funding could really derail those efforts.
It really highlights the challenges of balancing those national interests with the need for global cooperation when it comes to tackling a problem as big as climate change.
Yeah, for sure. Countries often prioritize their own economic and political agendas, and sometimes those clash with the collective action that's needed to address a global challenge like climate change.
Absolutely. And then at the same time, the Trump administration's policies are also creating a very complex political landscape within the U.S.
Definitely. You've got this clash between the administration's focus on traditional energy industries and then this huge and growing economic opportunity that we're seeing in the clean energy sector. And a lot of that growth is happening in Republican states. It's creating a lot of tension and debate.
And this actually brings us to the economic realities of climate change, a topic that sometimes gets a little bit overshadowed by the environmental aspects.
Yeah, I mean, climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's an economic one, too. And it's having real, tangible consequences.
One really striking example of this is the fire insurance crisis that we're seeing unfold in California.
Oh, right.
With these increasingly frequent and destructive wildfires, private insurers are just becoming more and more reluctant to provide coverage in those high-risk areas.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
It leaves homeowners with very few options and facing potentially really crippling costs.
And as climate change intensifies and those extreme weather events become even more common, I think we're going to see those same insurance challenges pop up in other parts of the world, too. So it raises some really tough questions about, who ultimately bears the financial burden of climate change and how we can build a system for managing these risks that's more resilient and more equitable.
It seems like it creates this vicious cycle where climate change leads to more disasters, which then lead to financial instability, which then makes it even harder for these communities to recover and adapt.
It really does. And I think to break that cycle, we need a multifaceted approach, one that involves government policies, private sector innovation, and even individual actions.
So if we're talking about mitigating these economic risks, what role can governments play?
Well, they can implement policies that encourage investment in climate adaptation and resilience. So that could include things like providing financial assistance to homeowners who are struggling with those insurance costs, or investing in infrastructure upgrades to make sure that our roads and bridges and buildings can actually withstand these extreme weather events, and then also supporting research and development of new technologies specifically designed for managing climate risks.
It just seems like addressing climate change really requires us to look at the big picture and consider not only the environmental impacts, but the social and economic consequences as well.
I completely agree. It's about creating a sustainable future that is both environmentally sound and economically viable,
Yeah.
and a future that ensures a just and equitable transition for everyone.
So we've talked about those political roadblocks and the economic challenges, but what about the information landscape surrounding climate change? I mean, it's an area where there's a lot of misinformation and conflicting narratives.
Yeah, for sure. It really does require you to have your critical thinking cap on and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Especially with social media and, this constant bombardment of information from all different sources. It's so easy to get caught in those echo chambers or fall prey to misleading claims.
It is, so it's really important to make sure you're getting your information from credible sources. Look to reputable scientific organizations, peer-reviewed journals, fact-checking websites. Don't just rely on social media or partisan news outlets for your climate information.
So it's really about being a discerning consumer of information, evaluating those sources, and looking for evidence-based data.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to question what you hear and consult multiple perspectives. It's through an informed and engaged citizenry that we can hold our leaders accountable and make better decisions about our collective future.
Well, let's explore some of those potential pitfalls and roadblocks on the path to a sustainable future and what we can do to navigate those challenges effectively.
Right.
Welcome back. So we've spent some time talking about the political maneuvering and the economic realities of climate change. And we've touched on the information landscape and how tricky that can be to navigate. But now I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and look ahead at some of those potential roadblocks that we might encounter on the path towards a sustainable future.
Yeah, I think one of the most significant challenges is just the sheer inertia of the systems that already exist. We've built our entire energy infrastructure, transportation networks, whole industries around fossil fuels. So transitioning away from that, from something that's so deeply entrenched, is going to require a lot of effort, a ton of investment, and a whole lot of time.
It's kind of like trying to turn a giant oil tanker. It doesn't happen quickly. So what are some of the key obstacles that you think we need to be prepared to deal with?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is going to be resistance from those powerful vested interests.
Yeah.
The fossil fuel industry, for example, has a long history of lobbying against climate action and even promoting misinformation to protect its profits. So to overcome that resistance, it's going to take strong political will and a lot of public pressure.
And another challenge comes from the fact that climate change is a global issue.
Right.
So it requires international cooperation and really coordinated action. But as we've seen with those delayed climate plan submissions and the U.S. withdrawing from the Green Climate Fund, achieving that level of cooperation is really difficult. It seems like national interests often end up clashing with what's best for the collective good.
Yeah, and even with the best intentions, there's always a chance of running into those unintended consequences. I mean, I think the nickel mining boom is a good example of that. The push for electric vehicles, which is great for reducing emissions, has inadvertently led to all sorts of environmental damage and social problems in countries like Indonesia.
So it feels like this very delicate balancing act. We need to move quickly to transition to clean energy, but we have to do it in a way that minimizes harm and ensures that there's a just transition for those workers who are employed in those traditional energy industries, and then also make sure we're promoting sustainable practices throughout the entire supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to be adaptable and willing to learn as we go. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to climate change. We'll need to constantly reevaluate our strategies and be open to new ideas and innovations, and we'll have to adjust our approach when necessary.
So, in light of all of these daunting challenges,
Yeah.
what can we as individuals do? Do our actions actually make a difference?
I really believe they do. Systemic change is crucial, but individual actions, especially when multiplied by millions of people, can create a very powerful force. I mean, there are so many things that you can do in your own life to contribute to a more sustainable future. Reduce your energy consumption. Make a conscious effort to choose sustainable products whenever you can. Support businesses that actually prioritize environmental and social responsibility.
It sounds like it's about making conscious choices and really using our purchasing power to send a message, and also being willing to advocate for change within our communities and beyond.
And it's about using your voice. Talk to your friends and family about climate change. Share information that you've learned. Engage in constructive dialogue. The more people who understand the issue, the more likely we are to see those systemic changes that we need. Support organizations that are working on climate solutions. Vote for leaders who prioritize climate action and hold those in power accountable for their decisions.
So it's not necessarily about being perfect. It's more about being informed and engaged and just taking action in whatever ways we can.
Yeah. And remember, the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something that we create. So by working together, we can build a future that is both prosperous and sustainable for generations to come.
And that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the very complex world of climate change. We hope that you found it insightful and even a little bit empowering. And remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep pushing for a better future. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.